Hey, good evening. Today I want to talk to you about the Ohio State Buckeyes. And I'm going to title this story is Ohio State Buying Cupcakes. This really comes to me from an anecdotal story just earlier this week. I was out on a pool tournament that I play in on some Tuesdays, and one of the partners that I got put with a random draw was wearing an Ohio State shirt. Knowing that I was already working on the Big Ten Championship program that releases this Friday, I looked I looked at him and said, "Hey, I see you like Ohio State." He says, "Oh, yeah, they're the best." I said, "Great, I'm glad you feel that way." I go, "What do you think about their schedule? What do you think about their opponents so far?" I go, "It's been pretty weak to start out with." His comment was really pretty simple in my mind, but really concerning at the same time. He looked at me and said, "Those teams got paid a lot of money to come and play us at Ohio State." I said, I didn't really respond at that point, but in the back of my mind, I had to ask myself the question, is that where we are with college football today? That if you get a really good preseason ranking, your best bet is just to buy off your first few games until you get to the conference play. As such, you preserve your rankings. Maybe somebody above you falters and you move up, but you don't have to worry about moving down. To me, I think it's one of the real problems with the ranking systems that's currently in college football. And Ohio State, whether meaning to do it or not, has been a huge benefactor of it throughout this year. So let's look at this from a couple of different perspectives. The first one I already mentioned was the number of home games that Ohio State has had on their schedule. I'm going to call this, they had an Uber Eats delivery of a schedule this year. Matter of fact, before up till this weekend, they've only played one away game. Everything else has been at home. Now, your question to me, or the question that my colleague at the pool tournament maybe said was, oh, they got paid a lot of money for it. Maybe that's true for Arkansas State and Toledo. I really don't think Notre Dame is in the business of coming out and having a pay game to pad your stats. So I really got to look at this and say maybe this was a little bit more of just the scheduling gods being in favor of them. But nonetheless, I think some competition committee ought to step in and say 8 out of 12 home games, that's not the way it should be. The second metric to look at is where their opponents were actually ranked, regardless if they played home or away. Although in most cases you're going to see they played at home. But going down this list, what you can see here is Arkansas State, Toledo, Rutgers, Michigan State, Iowa, Northwestern, Indiana. They're all in what I would call the bottom half of the FBS division. Why do I say it's the bottom half? Well, simple math, really. There's only 131 teams in the FBS. Divide that by two. So anyone ranked higher slash lower, however you want to describe that number, than 65 is the bottom half of the division. And 7 of those teams, so 7 out of 12 games in the Ohio State schedule, based upon today's rankings, were in the bottom half of the FBS. Don't really know what the stats are amongst all the other top 25 teams that are out there, but I can tell you from another stat that I'm keeping, this is pretty bad, especially for the top 10 that will come out there. What we got going on now is this week they play Penn State, and I think this becomes the first game where we get to learn something about who the Ohio State Buckeyes really are. Because when you look at these rankings, and especially with them playing at home, just where's the challenge, right? If you're playing number 109 Arkansas State and you're the number 2 team in the country, how do I know that winning by 33 points was the right number to win by? Why wasn't it 40? Why wasn't it 50? Right? Likewise, I could ask the same question about number 71 Michigan or number 74 Rutgers. These 29, 39 point margins, they're great for padding the stats of your players and probably making your defense and offense look great, but it doesn't really tell me what you're doing up against any kind of equally matched competition. And so I have to just say, I don't know who Ohio State is yet. And the big test will be October 29th against Penn State. So this is the other system that I was referring to. I keep track of this on a weekly basis when the AP Top 25 comes out. I call it my resume ranking. And what it is is I basically go through all the games that they've played, line it up with their current rankings against their opponents, and I score each game every week that they've played recursively back through the schedule. When you look at that, you can see Clemson, TCU, Georgia, Tennessee. I'd really say these are kind of my top performing teams that are out there. You can see they're generally undefeated, and if you think back through it, they've generally played more than one ranked opponent. Generally won. They've played home and away, and so that's what this score really reflects on them. When we look at Ohio State, they're sitting down here with a score of about 51.4. And that's really just barely above playing every game at home against an unranked opponent. And when we look at their schedule, that's kind of what they've done. So let's dig into it. I'll show you exactly where I come up with that and why I say I don't think we know who Ohio State is yet from a competition point of view. Here's the breakdown of Ohio State inside of my resume ranking system. You can see basically they've got an average of 51.4 points. You can see they generally get 50 points for every game that they've played, more or less because they've won. They got 60 points for the Michigan State game, because that's the one game this year that they've traveled for. When I line this up, I always look at the ranking, and then I calculate a rank difference. If this number would be negative, it means that Ohio State would have been the underdog within the game. But all of them are positive, so that means Ohio State should have been favored in every single game. Then I have a formula that goes through and looks at the margin of victory based upon the rank difference, meaning whether they were favored heavily or not. And from that, I determine whether or not any margin points should be given. Did they overperform and push a team or something like that? In this case, with Ohio State being heavily favored in every game, the fact that they blew them out is basically what was expected. And so we gave no additional points because I don't really feel as though I know from my prior arguments, you blew a team out that you were supposed to blow out. How do I know if you blew them out by enough? And like I said, I really think just your stats end up getting padded for both offense and defense as you play through those games. But the interesting thing here is this 51.4, like I said, ties them for 12th in the poll system. And the other big thing that I see here is that the average ranking of the opponents that they've played sits at about 73, which, as I mentioned before, is well below the halfway mark of the FBS division. In conclusion, I think it's really clear that it's much, much easier to get a preseason ranking and play to not lose it, especially within your schedule with a ton of home games and a ton of weak opponents, that it's really difficult for those people, once they've put you in that top 5 seeding, for them to bring you down unless you really do something wrong and or lose. I think that's what's happening with Ohio State right now. They were given a very favorable preseason ranking, and they've had an extremely favorable schedule up to this point. It really makes me think back to the old 1984 BYU Cougars when they won the national championship. This is prior to the BCS, and the big argument at the time was, while they beat everybody handily, they hadn't played anyone significant. Perhaps their most difficult game was the Holiday Bowl, where they took on a Michigan team who wasn't the Big Ten champion that year either. And so there was a lot of controversy around whether or not that was a legitimate title. And in many ways, this was one of the really early motivators for starting the BCS and coming up with the BCS power rankings. So I'm very curious to see if the BCS power rankings are going to take all of this into account, which by their formula and based on their mission statement, they should. Those rankings come out next week, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot to talk about. Last question, going back to our initial anecdote. Did they buy it? No, I don't think they did. Definitely Notre Dame's not a buy game. Perhaps those 2 other games were, and then the rest of it was a favorable conference schedule that gave them 5 home games this year, whereas next year they'll only get 4. So I think that's where we're at. I think this is a real challenge, perhaps, that exists within college football. And really, there needs to be a little more effort to make sure that the games that are played in September and the conference matchups that occur really help to drive us to know who the best teams are in the country. It's not necessarily their main goal right now. Their main goal is to drive ratings and to create a storyline. But that's what we really need, especially with such a limited college football playoff. All right, that's our show for today. Thank you so much for being with us. Take a look at my Big Ten Conference Championship program that I put out this Friday as well. Touches on a few of these other key discussions, but also looks at everybody else in the Big Ten and who's the contenders there. Subscribe and like if you want to see more of these. We publish every Monday and Friday.